Um, welcome to all of you. Welcome to Second Saturday Conversation, where we are exploring Christianity in and for the 21st century. Our overarching kind of canopy for this year, I'm hesitant to call it a theme, but the overarching canopy is telling the story again anew. Telling the story again anew. And perhaps with the subtitle, I have a dream that one day, I have a dream that one day. And with that subtitle, I think it's important that we ask, what does this dream desire? My interest in telling the story again anew is not so much about a haste to construct a different way of telling the Christian story. Because if we already have a sense of how we want to retell it, it kind of falls in the category of what's been called the regime of the same. So how to let it tell a new story as we loosen it from dogmatic and doctrinal moorings and certain mindsets. How do we let it tell its story anew? My hope is that Christianity for the 21st century will be better, if it's going to be at all. And perhaps another way to say this, much clearer, I'm going to borrow from the 35th chapter of Isaiah. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what I hope. Megan, why don't you give us some orientation to mics and all of that and the technical stuff. Megan McCluskey, who I could not do this without her help. So Megan, help us out now to tell us a little bit about how to orient ourselves.
Of course. Good morning, everyone. Happy Saturday. I have as I said all of last year and continue this year, the slightly unsavory portion of the morning to be the reminder to keep yourselves muted throughout the morning unless you're called upon. If you do have questions or comments, I ask that you direct them to the chat, which you can find kind of at the bottom of this window. There's 3 dots and you can click chat, which you should be able to find. So we want to use the chat space as a place for your comments related to the topic for the day. We will draw from that chat space for our plenary session. And if you want to be called upon, you can also indicate that in the chat. Before the plenary, we will give you a few minutes to write those comments or questions. That being said, we'll have a plenary at the end of the presentation with Jeff Cresswell, our moderator. This will be a time to reflect on the thoughts and ideas shared by Marianne and Jack this morning. If you would like to personally connect with Marianne, we're offering a coffee time from 11 to 11:15 after the presentation and plenary. Again, if you have any questions during the conversation, please direct them to the chat. Please keep yourselves muted unless called upon by Jeff or myself, and we will be monitoring that chat during this session this morning. During the plenary, Jeff will call on you to ask your question or share your thoughts, at which time you can unmute yourself. Thank you so much for your time and space, and enjoy the morning.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Today, we are honored to have as our guest, Jacques Caputo. As a boy in Catholic school, the nuns called Jack John. So I don't want to make that mistake today. Jacques Caputo. And as those of you who've been with us last year and now into this year, I'm building on the foundational work of Marcus as an historian and biblical scholar to help us see Christianity again, if you will. And I've also been weaving some thoughts and wisdom from Jacques Caputo. I think that Jack and Mark are sort of headed in the same kind of trajectory, but they go about it differently. And Jack brings us another kind of language and encourages us to make some additional moves. So I've been sort of incorporating Marcus and Jack in my own thinking. Jack might be known as Mr. Radical Theology, or Herr Doctor Professor Radical Theology, or Brother Radical Theology. But that hardly gives you a sense of the man. Hello, good morning, Jack. There you are. Jack was our guest for one session last year. I'm delighted that he's with us today, and he'll be with us 2 more times this year, in January, when he's going to talk about prayer, and then again in April. So let me give you a sense of the timeline for today. I'm going to ask Jack a couple of prompting questions, and then that will go on for a good 30 minutes, something like that, maybe a little bit more. And then we will move into the plenary time, which will give you all an opportunity to ask Jack about some things that you've been thinking of. I'll do about a 5-minute close, and then at about 11:05, we'll have coffee time, and Jack will be joining us for coffee time. So I asked Jack to be with us on this day, October 9, because it's the death date anniversary date of Jacques Derrida. And Jacques Derrida has been deeply influential to Jack. I would not have known what to think of Derrida if it weren't for Jack. So Jack has deeply influenced me. Derrida deeply influenced Jack. There is no one better to give us an idea of who Jacques Derrida was and why he's important than Jacques Caputo. But this actually brings to mind a little story I want to tell about Marcus. Mark told me that at one of his lectures that his hosts decided that they would have 2 little puppets, 2 little doggy puppets, introduce Marcus Borg. So they had these 2 little doggy puppets, and one of them just, was saying, "Oh boy, today Marcus Borg is here. I'm just so excited. I just can't wait to hear him, Marcus Borg, And then the other pup went on to say, "Yes, I'm just thrilled. Marcus Borg is here, and I just can't wait to hear him." And then this other pup just paused for a minute and kind of looked around and said, "Who's Marcus Borg?" Well, some of us today might say, "Who's Jacques Derrida?" I hope we don't say that about who's Marcus Borg or who's Jacques Caputo, but we might say, who's Jacques Derrida? So I wanted Jack to give us a sense of who is Jacques Derrida. And I first want Jack to, tell us briefly who he is, identify him. And then, and this is more important for me, I'd like Jack to reflect on how Derrida has influenced his own thinking. At what point in his own journey did he become introduced to Derrida? How has Derrida, if this is appropriate language, sort of transformed some things for him, or even loosened or freed some things, if that's even an appropriate way to approach this. But I'd love to know how Derrida influenced Jack, how he would talk about that. And then after that, I'd love him to say a couple of things about why Derrida is important for us as we think about even Christianity in the 21st century. Okay, so Jack, I am delighted to have you here. And if you would tell us a little bit about who is Jacques Derrida, and then I'd love to hear you start reflecting on your own journey and how is it that he came into your life and made a difference, and how has it shaped you? And how do you want to go about this? There's so much to explore with Derrida's thoughts, but I'm going to turn it over to you now and bring us along.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's great to be part of this thing, part of anything with the name of Marcus Borg attached to it, and to be in the to be a little boat in the great vessel that he was plowing as he plowed through the waters of a more radical Jesus. So it's a great honor to be here. Jacques is if you haven't heard of Derrida, you probably have heard the word deconstruction. That word has actually worked its way into the vocabulary, sort of hot, into our cultural vocabulary. Okay, and it's got a kind of negative. Sounds bad. Deconstruction sounds like you're out to wreck something. And so I don't think it's the best way to describe what he does, but it is sort of caught on. So who was he? Well, he was a Algerian, French-speaking Algerian Jew. So he had sort of a lot of minority things going on there all at once, because Algeria was colonial Algeria was a very, very French, very Catholic. And he said the expression "les catholiques," he meant everybody who wasn't Jewish. You know, all the powers that be were not Jewish. And but he was French speaking, right? So that uprooted him a little bit from this what would have been otherwise an Islamic culture. So there's the voice of Islam in his work. There's the voice of Judaism, and he's a French speaking. He says that he spoke Christian, Latin, French. So, which is packs a lot of stuff. But the whole Greco-Christian philosophical theological culture is built right into his language. So he says he doesn't have his own language. He has a mother tongue, but he doesn't speak a language of his own. He speaks Christian, Latin, French. When he was about, so the other thing is about Algeria, what you got to remember about Algeria we should remember about Algeria, is that in antiquity, it was called Numidia, and it was the home of St. Augustine. Right? So he grew up in Algiers, which was about 100 miles from Hippo, classic times Hippo. And so there was this, and in fact, he lived for a while in the Rue Saint Augustin. And so there's this, Augustine's sort of in the air. Now, the other guy who was from Algeria, who has a sort of comparable in many ways, is Camus. Camus was also a French-speaking Algerian, but he was Catholic. And he actually wrote a dissertation on Neoplatonism, which was included a chapter on Augustine. So Augustine is sort of in the cultural air of the high culture of Algeria. Even though he's a Jew, he's a French-speaking Jew. So like Camus, he had mixed feelings about the revolution. He was all for the press, but and he was all for post-colonial world, but he loved French and he loved French culture. And so he didn't want, like Camus, he didn't want there to be war between France and the motherland and Algeria. At the age of 19, he crosses the Mediterranean on a boat to go to Paris to study philosophy. And within a few years, he has sort of lost his, he sort of stopped practicing his Jewish religion, which he had been doing when he was living at home with his home life, his parental life. They weren't ultra conservative. They were sort of assimilated Jews, but he was Jewish, and he got us a fair amount of that Jewish upbringing. In fact, he ended up in a Jewish school and he got kicked out of. He was born in 1930, so he's 10 years old just as the war breaks out, and he got kicked out of school by the Catholic, by the Vichy government. because he was Jewish. So he had to go to a Jewish school. He hated the Jewish school. He went to Paris and studied philosophy, studied in the best schools. You know, he sounds like he's an outsider, but he studied in the best schools and then taught in the École Normale Supérieure, which is a prestigious place in the French Quarter. And he was brilliant, you know, and he started writing this stuff when he was in his early 30s, and bang, it just was exploded onto the scene. With this analysis, basically, it started out as an analysis of language, and then it became a broader analysis of culture at large. The word that they use in the academy for the movement that he was a part of is called post-structuralism. So bear with me, I'm not going to bury you in this stuff, but just this much. Structuralism was a theory that says the structures of our mind and of our language are built into our head. So you could hold it in a sort of reductionistic way, but it's just the way the brain is wired. Or you could hold it as a sort of, these were ideal laws that hold for any thinking being, you know, on any planet, anywhere, anytime. You will think like this. You will think that 2 and 2 is 4, no matter what species you belong to. Either way, structuralism says human intelligence, human life, human culture is built around very firm laws that in which there are different examples of the laws, but the laws are always the same. So if you study all the mythologies of the world, you'll discover a common structure in all the mythologies. All the religions of the world, all the cultures of the world, the common structure. Okay. And the post-structuralists said, no. Okay. If that's the case, that's what we would today call a closed system. Okay. So the post-structuralists said, no, it's the systems are not closed, and particularly the one that they were talking about all the time, which was language. So when you think of language, what you realize is a living thing. It's moving, and you know, if it doesn't simply just keep coming up with examples of the same laws, it keeps evolving. It doesn't just make new moves in an old game; it invents new games, and like that. So that's sort of post-structuralism in that. Okay. There you go. There's structuralism and post-structuralism in a nutshell. Structuralists say it's always the same game, you just make new moves in the same game. Post-structuralists say, nope, we're constantly inventing new games. The movement from Ptolemy to Copernicus is not just a new move in an old game, it's a whole new game. It's a whole the movement from Newton to Einstein, that's a whole new game. The movement from classical art to Picasso, that's a whole new game. Right? So post-structuralism is open-ended quasi-systems. They're not anti-systems. If there were anti-systems, it'd be chaos. Okay. So they're innovations on systems that renew. They tell the story in a new way. They're reinventions of things that mutate, and then at certain sort of thresholds, do more than just mutate. They transform into some new breakthrough, in-breaking, transforming, new gestalt, okay, and which Derrida calls the event. So I like to think of it as a philosophy of the event. The word deconstruction is only capturing the sort of negative element, namely that these systems are revisable, reinventable. But there's an affirmative point. The affirmative point is to get from Newton to Einstein, or to get from Ptolemy to Newton, or to Copernicus. So the point of it all is to keep the systems open and exposed, and also at risk. Also at risk, because nothing guarantees that a breakthrough that shakes up the old system is going to be for the better. It could be for the worse. So it's a kind of risky thing. Well, Derrida started writing these things in the late 60s, early 70s, and bang, it was a big sensation. It was mostly in literary circles. Okay. Then it spread out, and then he started coming to the United States, and that's where I met. Okay. And today is the day of his anniversary of his death. And the last conversation I had with him was about 2 months before he died, and he said to me, he was 74. He said to me, I will never understand what it means when people say they have come to grips with their death. And I said, me neither. I don't get
Me
it
neither. I think we could all say that together.
Me neither.
Me neither. So just
So-
say that, I mean, just say that again to us, that one of the last conversations the last conversation you had with him, he said to you.
Yeah, he says, I will never understand what it means when people say, I have come to grips with my death. So do not go gently into that dark night. You know, he was, and he was, from my point of view, I'll be 81 in about 2 weeks. He died at the age of 74. So from my point of view, he died young.
Agreed.
And so death was on his mind all the time. He always said it never went by. That day never will pass. So he wasn't thinking about that. I'm learning how to die. Which is one of the ancient definitions of philosophy. Plato described philosophy as learning, preparation for death, learning how to die. Which really means learning how to live, right? Because
right. Right.
hungry.
And learning how to die or learning how to live is very different than death.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a way to hold life precious, and so there's nothing I'll tell you honestly, my first reaction to Derrida was negative.
Okay.
Because I had not studied it. I was just hearing it. You know, I would go to conferences and I would hear what people were saying, and but, I mean, I began in a sort of very Catholic world. I was actually a member of a religious order for a while. And so I had to sort of evolve out of that. And I wasn't taught by ultra-conservative Catholics. The people who taught me were relatively progressive, but they were progressive Catholics. They were Orthodox Catholics. They were sort of Vatican II Catholics. You know, they were looking for renewal, but they didn't want to throw the baby out with the wash. And so I was always open to hearing new things, but I didn't want to throw the baby out with the wash. So the first thing that sort of drew me out of my Catholicism, ultra-Catholicism, Orthodox Catholicism, was Heidegger. So the first thing, and Heidegger was very important to me, but the first thing that I heard about Derrida was this criticism of Heidegger. So I didn't like that. Heidegger was very important to me. And, but then I just decided to read it carefully, because if I was going to, in academia, if you want to criticize somebody, you better know what you're talking about, because they'll eat you alive. If you go to a conference and start criticizing something, and there are specialists out there in the audience, you'll hear about it. So I decided I better read this carefully. And when
by the way, I'm surprised I haven't been eaten alive already. But anyway, go ahead.
But when I began to read it very carefully, then I realized he's on to something. It's important. It's important stuff. So that's who he is, and he was one of 3 or 4 really important French philosophers in the 20th century. Another one would have been a man like Michel Foucault, who was also quite well known. Foucault and Derrida, I would say, that were the most important French philosophers in the second half of the 20th century. The first half of the century would have been Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir. They dominated the French world up till the 60s. And then the post-structuralists began to emerge.
And you yourself are a post-structuralist.
Yes, yeah, because I mean, that just means, you have a theory of open systems.
Right. Which means possibilities, or to use another word, the impossible.
Yeah,
sort of a passion for the impossible, right? It's future oriented.
The uttermost limit of the possible would be the impossible.
Okay.
So you have the expression, think about this, the possibility of the impossible. Now, in rigorous logical terms, that's the contradiction. It can't be, right? So what does it mean? Well, it means the sense of the impossible is not purely logical. So we're not saying a square circle. But you're saying beyond the realm of imagination, shattering, inbreaking. In religion, you call it revelation, something eye-opening. So when Copernicus started, when the theory, the Copernican theory got in circulation, it was absurd to imagine.
Okay.
Imagine, just try to imagine that the Earth is actually moving. That it's turning and rotating. The greatest philosopher, the astronomer of the day, thought that Copernicus's mathematics were brilliant, but he couldn't believe that the Earth was moving. So he says, okay, well, there must be two centers. Copernicus has shown that the sun is the center, but we all know the Earth is not moving. So everything must be moving around both those things at once. And he tried to come up with the mathematics to explain that. Tycho Brahe, he was the full professor at Harvard, you know, of the day, who was the leading astronomer of the day. And he saw that what Copernicus said made ringing sense mathematically. But he couldn't believe it. Why? It was impossible that the Earth was moving. So it's the thing that shatters the impossible means the thing that shatters our horizon of expectation.
Okay.
Right. So that doesn't mean a logical contradiction. It just means if you come up against it, you can't imagine that. And now I think that Derrida might think, but whether he does or he doesn't, I think that's kind of what the way the word God works in the scripture. With God, all things are possible. So you have a structure there. You know, you have a experiential insight there, where it's where in the scriptures we organize it around the name of God. So what's the name of God doing? Breaking up the system. It's keeping the system from closing, which is sort of the opposite way to think about God, because people like to think of God as the one who's the steady center, keeps all things in order, the governor of the universe, and he's behind all the laws and all the regularities. But that's not the way it looks in the New Testament. He's the source of the irregularities, the miracles, the astounding things. With God, all things are impossible. All things are possible, even the impossible. With humans, it's not possible, but with God, all things are. Now, I think that is an experiential insight.
Okay.
In deconstruction.
Okay.
It's picking up on scripture. Is it because he grew up Jewish? Maybe. Whether he did it or he didn't, it's on to something, right? See, and that's why I like to think that when this word deconstruction is not so good. It's misleading. It's a good word, but it's misleading. Because it takes your eye off this other thing, this openness, this open-endedness, this futurity, hope, promise, expectation, which is not Greek. You know, Greeks don't think like that.
Okay.
Right? The Greeks think in terms of the cosmos, the order of things.
Right.
But the Jews don't. The Jews think in terms of prophetic time, messianic time.
Okay.
And I think, if you wrote a biography of Derrida, I think you would probably want to say that's culturally why he thinks like that. I mean, it's completely, from a philosophical point of view, it has nothing to do with theology. It's a theory of, it's a systems theory. To put it in the most cold-blooded terms, it's a systems theory. It's a theory of open-ended systems.
Yeah. And you mentioned, though, that this is an insight or an awareness that comes from experience. I mean, even this notion of the open-endedness of things, the fact that things are not, to have things close in on themselves is to defy the nature of things, that things actually are intended to open and change, and that there really is a possibility that there is something new under the sun. I mean, is that, but that, because I think you use the word experience about this, is also experiential. So it's not just an intellectual insight, but it's something that resonates on an experiential level. Is that fair to say?
Otherwise it's got no credentials.
Okay.
No,
So that's an important
there's no
part.
cash in its account. You know?
Okay.
I mean, this is one of the things that I think happens in 20th century, 21st century philosophy, is it becomes, you don't have quite as much of the classical philosophical speculation about the nature of reality.
Mm-hmm.
That has more and more and more been taken over by the sciences.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the Middle Ages, before the birth of modernity, the word philosophy just meant everything we know. And there wasn't any distinction between physics and philosophy, but physics was a part of philosophy. But once the mathematical sciences got going, up and running, speculations about the ultimate nature of reality required knowing a great deal of mathematics. And that didn't eliminate philosophy by a long shot, but it did change the scene. And it meant that philosophers, and I think it brought out the real meaning of philosophy, which I think ultimately converges with theology, which is that what philosophers do is they don't talk about so much about what the world is in itself. For that, you need a lot of mathematics, but our relationship with the world, our experience of the world. And I think ultimately philosophy and theology are both, in philosophy you call that phenomenology. I've been avoiding the word phenomenology, but I'm using the word experience, experiential. But in philosophy you call that phenomenology as opposed to classical philosophical speculation. But let's just say experiential. So I think philosophy is trying to dig into the deep structures of experience. Our experience of the world, of one another, physical world, and what are we with God? Let's just say God, without further ado. And I think the same thing's true of theology, which could get us off on another track, which is that I don't think theology has to do with supernatural revelations that sort of drop down into our lap. I think theology is just another way to talk about experience, but it's picking up on certain things. There are things it's looking for, something sacred, something holy, something of unconditional value and importance and worth. But it's basically giving us a phenomenology, an experiential account of the world and our relationship to the world. That's why philosophy and theology work together.
Yeah, and if I'm hearing you right, what this suggests is that, where faith used to be concerned about certainty, that no, faith is not about that at all. That faith is not certainty, that deconstruction has more to do with the impossible and desire for something else, more, whatever. So it's a different way. I mean, if what you were saying earlier about, God is the, mastermind and has a plan and is all sovereign and is the ultimate truth, which in certain places you've said capital T truth can be a threat, that's not it. That whatever we're talking about in terms of God or faith or hope, that it's something else, that there, as you might put it, something else is happening in that. And it's not for us to, it's like the transfiguration text of, well, let's build 3, institutions right here to honor what we've just seen. It's not that. If there's something more, something more fluid. I hate to use that word, but But there's something more dynamic. I mean, is that right? And that
Yeah.
if in thinking about Christianity, and even Christianity for the 21st century, if dogmatic and doctrinal certitude is part of what they think are the weight-bearing walls of Christianity, this suggests that no, those aren't the weight-bearing walls of Christianity, that actually it's something else that's going on in the name of Christianity.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean,
That's why Marcus,
so tell.
that's why I'm a member of the Westar Institute, and why Marcus is Marcus and I are, I think, making the same point.
I do too.
He, as a historian, that I that would never begin to attempt to do. I mean, I have to be but I always like to say, I don't want to live forever, but I wouldn't mind being reincarnated a couple of times. Once as a theoretical physicist, because I think that stuff is deep, but once as an historical Jesus guy, so that I could get into those discussions with Marcus and Brandon Scott and those guys, Tom Crossan.
By the way, Marcus wanted to come back as a basketball player, but never mind.
I brought Tom Crossan to Villanova one time for a Derrida conference. So I got them in the same room, but I couldn't get them on the same page. I couldn't get them talking to each other. But anyway, what the historical Jesus people do, I think, is to demythologize and deconstruct the supernaturalist picture of Jesus and of the New Testament itself. And they tell us, look, this is a book written that got collected in a sort of haphazard way, and a lot of fragments and a lot of lost texts and rewritings and copyists and all kinds of stuff. But we got it. Now we got it. And it's written by people whose lives threaten to be short, and what is Hobbes' thing? Short, nasty, brutal, and lonely. Lonely, sad, and short, brutal, and nasty, Hobbes said. Our lives are threatened with that. And these are people who are telling a story, reenacting something, cultivating a memory of this guy who lost in the fog of history, who made a lasting impression on all of them. They couldn't forget him. They killed him, but he wouldn't stay dead. And they started writing it down. Why? Because something of elemental importance had happened. Not, supernatural events, but some very deep experience of human mortal life.
And what do you think that was?
Huh?
What do you think that was?
Well, in the case of Jesus, it's concentrated in I think in the parables and the kingdom of God saves. Okay. The whole notion of the coming of a world, what the world would look like if God ruled, not the Romans, not the powers that be, not Satan and his minions, not the powers of principality. What the world would look like if mercy ruled, and compassion ruled, and love of your enemies ruled, and meekness ruled. What would the world look like? So that was a poem. I think that was a Theo poem.
Okay.
Written and recounted and recounted and recounted until it finally got passed down to us in the form that we've got it, which was saying something like that. I don't think it was the supernatural. See, I think supernaturalism is the enemy. The deconstruction. Now, as a philosopher, I think that the historical Jesus people are coming from here, and as a philosopher, I'm coming from here.
Okay.
And we meet in the middle. And the middle is, what I, as a philosopher, think is, for philosophical reasons, these are what's happening in religious scriptures is a imaginative, theo-poetic birthing of an insight into life
Okay.
which has nothing to do with the supernatural order, but has to do with the experiential order of uh, something of Tillich says of elemental, unconditional importance.
Okay.
With Tillich's definition of religion, matter of ultimate concern. Great definition of religion, matter of ultimate concern. So I have, for philosophical reasons, been driven into a kind of theology of the event that is going on in religion generally, I would say, but in the New Testament in particular, because that's the one that it's mine, the one I was born into. So when you think like that, then you say, well, then you want to distinguish faith from belief.
Okay.
Beliefs are the stuff that's in your head because of the world in which you were born, and the language that you were given to speak, and the body you inherited, and the culture, and the family, and the
kind of structuralism.
the whole thing. Yeah. Well, what the Heidegger calls it their facticity. As a matter of fact, I was born in Philadelphia.
Okay.
I think I've told you this before. Once I was lecturing in the Sultanate of Oman in the Middle East, and afterwards, this Muslim theologian who was a liberal, he said, "Look," he says, "the reason I'm a Muslim and you're a Christian is that you were born in Philadelphia and I was born in Muscat." And I said, yeah. And if we were switched at birth, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just true. If we were switched at birth, I wouldn't be talking about the kingdom of God and Jesus and English and have, studied Latin and Greek and French and German. It would have just been a different body of beliefs.
Yeah.
But faith is what's going on in those beliefs.
Okay.
Because the beliefs could be different. What we call the gift of faith is more dispassionately described an accident of birth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
If you were born somewhere else, you just wouldn't believe these things. You wouldn't have those beliefs in your head. But you would have a heart.
Yeah.
A philosophical, theological heart. And religion has to do with the heart, where that's not taken in some PMZ sort of touchy-feely sense, but in the sense of some very deep resonance with the world, some elemental relationship to the world, to one another.
Yeah. And is this related to the prophetic call or to a sense of promise? That, not to try to seek a oneness in all of these religions, but that there is something, though, that functions within them all that, do you think it is a kind of call that assumes that, yes, the future can be better?
Yeah, see, this is important. I think that what you don't want to say is what the old comparative religion theologies used to say, which is that they're all the great religions are the same. They're just sort of different window dressing, different garments. They lace on different garments, but underneath they're all the same. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think that what is the same is that there's some kind of deep structure there. You could make some kind of distinction maybe between belief and faith that would apply to them all. But it would be a different, they're not the same experience. The Buddhist experience of the world is quite different than what we're talking about right now. Mm-hmm. I do think that what Derrida has to say as a philosopher, which is what I picked up on because of my interest in religion, is prophetic. It's Jewish. It's about history, time, the future, hope, expectation, promise. Now that's a different categorical hat, or it's a different set of categories than Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't talk like that.
Mm.
It talks in terms of a kind of stillness, quietness,
Mm.
peace, oneness,
Mm.
rest. Yeah. It's different. It's different. I mean, you find that in the West too. You'll find it in some of the Neoplatonic mystics talk like that. But when the Neoplatonic mystics talk like that, Christian Neoplatonics talk like that, they had a problem because Jesus didn't talk like that.
Mm.
And the New Testament doesn't talk like that. And the Jewish scriptures don't talk like that. They think in terms of time and history and movement and life and death. And, it's a different. I think that all the various what we call religions reflect a deep experience of things. But I don't think it's the same deep experience. I think there are different. There are different views, deep views of things that there is sort of cultural polymorphism. But ours is prophetic. Ours is historical. God is God of history, time, future, hope, promise, expectation, the messianic, and I think that Derrida picks up on it. In the early works, he didn't. He was talking about literature all the time, and he was advocating new ways to read classical texts, and he got the reputation for thinking that people thought that he meant to make a text say anything at all. And then a lot of the people that were sort of miming him in English departments in the United States did that, and so he got sort of a bad name, actually. It was part of my first impression. Okay. But when you get into it, then you see, no, it's not bad. It's the theory of time and hope and promise. Okay. But the promise is also a risk because you may screw everything up.
Right.
If you question your inherited presuppositions, you could screw things up. It might be worse. What he calls the event could be bad news. It could be a terrible trauma. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think this messianic prophetic historical temporal thing is very distinctively Christian Jewish, and it shows up in his Jewishness.
Okay. This might be a little off topic, but I'm struck by the fact that you were a brother for many years, right? And so you said yes to those vows, right? And that commitment, which, if I understand, you've never really fully left them. But somewhere you say that a yes requires a second yes. A counter yes that sort of brings you into maybe even the fullness of the first yes. Okay, this may sound a little abstract, but what I'm curious about was saying yes to your life as a brother, and then saying yes to deconstruction and Derrida and post-structural philosophy and all of that. Was that a second yes? In your own journey, was it kind of a movement into your first yes that actually opened you up into this one that maybe you would not have imagined when you said your first yes?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, with this, Derrida would do this. We bien, we. He said, "Come, yes, yes," and you say, "Well, why do you say yes, yes? Why not yes?" Well, in French, you say we a lot. It's a common expression. But he makes a thing about it. He has several different things about it. One of them is the first yes is the world, the other, God, being, addressing us.
Uh-huh.
First yes is a call, saying yes. And then the second yes is our response. So he does that. But it also has this other sense where you don't just say yes and then it's over. Like when you get married, you say yes, Well, we'll see whether you said yes. Time will tell whether you're really saying yes.
Right.
We'll find out when you say I do, we'll find out if you do. It'll take some time.
Right.
And so that has to be repeated constantly, so that you're writing the story of your life. You're creating yourself. You're forging your own character. And if you go back to the faith beliefs distinction, you might retract a lot of your beliefs.
Okay.
So the beliefs you could say are positions you've taken, but you might find it necessary to retract those beliefs or those positions in order to stay faithful to the faith, the underlying faith, which is the affirmation, which is the yes. So you keep saying yes, yes, as the world changes on us, as the gyroscope shifts, and as things, new things happen and the unexpected happens. We have to keep repeating this yes. So you might at a certain point be saying yes to something that looks quite different from the thing you said yes to way back in the beginning.
Okay.
And that's sort of my theory of postmodern Christianity. That it's mutating. The world is mutating, and what we need to do is sort of keep alive to, alert to the underlying affirmation there, and not cling to the positions, beliefs.
Okay.
Because there's something deeper happening there, which is what concerns us, and that requires our ability to change our positions.
Okay.
And so it may look like you're changing, you're reversing yourself, or you're inconsistent. You probably are, some ways, but it's in the name of the underlying affirmation, the constant repetition of yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. And you're looking, you're searching. You keep saying yes, but searching, and we're affirming something we don't know quite what.
Uh-huh.
What's happening? What is going on in any really deep way? Trying to find that out. Trying to get a sense of that.
Right.
Not to comprehend it, but to become aware of it, to sort of resonate with it.
Right.
So yeah, the repetition of the yes, I think, is I mean, that's the first vows I took were poverty, chastity, and obedience in the Catholic religious order, and it was a good idea. My kids say to me, "Why'd you do that?" And I said, "Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time."
At the time.
And it was a great idea. I mean, it was life changing, and it was, when all the guys I graduated from high school went to college and were, let's say, exploring new fields, I had a vow of chastity and poverty and obedience, and I knew what those guys were doing. I knew what they were getting into and what was going on, but not me. I was poverty, chastity, and obedience, and it was in that world that I discovered philosophy and theology, but I had already discovered theology with philosophy, and it made all the difference in the world to me. I mean, it totally transformed me. I mean, I don't think I would have been desolate, some kind of rogue if I didn't go into religious life, but it was a very transformative experience, and I really did discover what I was into, what I wanted to do, what really interested me. And the only reason I left was I said to them, they were training me to be a high school teacher, and I said, "Look, I don't want to be a high school teacher. I want to teach college. I want to teach and we had a college, LaSalle University. I said, I want to teach in Catholic. I want to teach in LaSalle University. I want to teach philosophy, and I want to teach high school." And this was 1962, right before the Vatican II. And they said, "Well, you remember that you took this vow called obedience, and what you do with your life is not up to you. It's up to us, and because we're the will of God as it's expressed for you. Your job is to follow the will of God as expressed for you, the will of your spirit." And I said, "Well, there was a better answer than the one I gave. I just said, well, I'm sorry, I have to do my thing. I've discovered my vocation. In order to say yes for the second time, I have to change my position.
Okay.
And what I should have said to them then, but I didn't think of it, and I didn't have a good theory for it either. Because I just believed it. It was pre-Vatican II. I should have said, well, why isn't the will of God being expressed for me in my, my native aptitudes and disposition and interests, and, who I think I am? Why isn't that the will of God? Why is what you're saying the will of God?
Yeah. Great.
That would have been a better answer. And 10 years later, they would have listened to me because they were losing vacations.
Yeah.
Religious life was empty.
Yeah.
So, it's the same, and of course that word then was vocation, which means calling, and that's one of Derrida's and Heidegger's favorite words, the call. Something is addressing us.
Right.
Heidegger has a line at one point, it's the end of a kind of a very sort of poetic essay, and he says, is it God that calls, or the world, or the soul? Who's called? What's called? And I think that's our life is like that. There's something it's got us.
Yeah.
And
I
we're
agree.
trying to answer. We're trying to respond. We're trying to get into it.
Right. And in a sense, take some responsibility for that.
Well, that's it. See, because it's not like God. Kierkegaard said, if God were a great green bird and he appeared in the middle of Copenhagen, then we would all believe him, because you can see him. But he says God's a spirit, so we can't see him. And so what's God saying? Well, we have to interpret that, and we have to not simply respond to what God says, but we have to assume responsibility for what we're saying God says. Right.
I think that's really important.
Yeah. And that's what you call hermeneutics. That things don't just drop out of the sky into your lap fully formed. They need to be interpreted.
Right.
And that's another thing that the Jesus scholars like Marcus and continental European philosophers like Derrida and Heidegger have in common. There are no uninterpreted facts of the matter. Yeah. And that's of course a dangerous thing to say now, because we're in what you call post-truth, post-facts.
Yeah.
So there's an idea which is very important, and I think quite true, that has gone crazy.
Right.
We've lost the follow-up line after you say that there are no uninterpreted facts of the matter. The follow-up line is, but some interpretations are better than others.
Right. Fair enough.
Some are plausible and some are screwball. Now,
some stories are better than others.
Some stories are better. Now, you got to be careful with that, though, right? Because whenever somebody does something that's a real breakthrough, like Copernicus, like Picasso, we say, that's screwball. Right? Why? Because it's the impossible.
Right.
So this is why I'm a post-structuralist, because there aren't any rules that you can fall back on in these matters. You have to assume responsibility for your interpretation.
Right.
And the only rule is be honest to God.
Yeah.
That was a book that got Bishop John Robertson in a lot of trouble.
A lot of trouble. Yeah, right. Being honest to God can get you into trouble. Yeah. I'm aware that, I could just chat with you forever. I feel the need to make sure that other people have an opportunity to come in, because they'll come in with different thoughts and curiosity. So what I'd love to do now is to kind of move to a plenary time where some of our participants here who come today can ask you some questions. But in preparation for that, I'm actually going to take the time. It'll just take a minute or two to read through some listening guidelines People who've been with me last year are familiar with these. It's a kind of courtesy as we think about how we want to ask you questions and how we want to listen to one another. So Megan, why don't you just put up the discernment listening guidelines, and I'm going to read them, and then we'll invite people to offer some questions. The discernment listening guidelines from Listening Hearts Ministries says, take time to become settled in God's presence. Listen to others with your entire self, senses, feelings, intuition, imagination, and rational faculties. Do not interrupt. Pause between speakers to absorb what has been said. Do not formulate what you want to say while someone else is speaking. Speak for yourself only, expressing your own thoughts and feelings, referring to your own experiences, and avoid being hypothetical and stay away from broad generalizations. You know, these are not easy guidelines, but I think they're great. How about this one? Don't challenge what other people say. Listen to the group as a whole, to those who have not spoken aloud, as well as to those who have. Generally leave space for anyone who may want to speak a first time before speaking a second time yourself. And then I love this one, it's the last one. Hold your desires and opinions, even your convictions, lightly. So those are courtesy guidelines for our plenary time. I'm going to ring the bell and give us just a minute to have you formulate some thoughts, kind of what is stirring in you from this conversation, what questions you might have. I'm going to ring the bell, and then at the end of that 1 minute, I'll ring it again. And then at that point, I'm going to ask my friend Jeff if he would help us facilitate this plenary time. Okay, so this minute of silence will also just help us to kind of be present to what's all of this that's been stirring within us, and honor it. Hello, friend Jeff Cresswell.
Hi, Marianne.
Hi. Good luck. Good luck with this.
Morning, Jack. Man,
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff popping up here in the chat.
Pick the easy ones.
Yeah.
The
Good luck.
easy ones. I don't know if easy goes with any of these, but they're all very very intriguing.
And I think I see a friend of Jack's from, is it Singapore? Is it Hendra?
Malaysia.
Malaysia.
Yes, I am. Yeah, no, Singapore.
Oh,
Singapore.
it is Singapore.
Yeah.
Singapore, and yeah, I originally from Indonesia and back and forth in Singapore and Indonesia.
Ah, that's
Well,
good to
yeah.
see you.
Hendra, you did have a question there. Why don't we start with yours?
Yeah, sorry, Jeff. I kind of,
No, that's perfect.
yeah.
That's perfect.
Oh, I have a small curious about your thinking and Derrida. Since I read some of the readings, it seems difficult for me to find out any disagreement between you and Derrida. So I have quite curious whether you have any disagreement philosophically between you and Derrida. If have, in which part, in what sense, the differences between you and Derrida?
The only well, it was,
Thank you very much.
I have a sort of a personal one with him, and that is this is I don't know what this is. You know, Tillich was not a paradigm of morals in his personal life, that he was famous for wandering. Jacques had a theory of marriage, which he was upfront about. It wasn't he wasn't trying to pull anything over on anybody's eyes. When he got married, he said to his wife that he thought, who was a Catholic, Marguerite, that he thought that their relationship was uniquely one-to-one. Okay. But he said he thought it was possible to have several one-to-one relationships like that. And so he had this rather libertine view of sexual morality, which I don't, and then he well, anyway, I won't go into the rest of it, but that side of what he had to say, I think, was off, over the edge, beyond the pale, and I disagree with that.
Okay.
I also think he had that. This is a technical philosophical point that I'll just repeat. And we won't have to dwell on it. When he makes this distinction between the pure messianic and the various messianisms, like the distinction between faith and belief, he has a tendency to say that, make it sound like the pure messianic is a universal a priori form, a structure, of which the various messianisms are cases or instances, that they fall under that universal as cases, instances of a universal, called the pure messianic. He absolutely should not say that. And he drifts into saying that frequently, and I don't think he should. I think, the messianic is just one more contingent construction, just like everything else. I don't think there is a pure messianic. But your question also brings up another point, and that is that in many, many ways, I think deconstruction is more of a how than a what. It's more of a style of thinking and a body of beliefs.
That's interesting.
He has specific views about the European Union, about marriage, and about other things that I don't necessarily agree with. But the style of thinking, which is that we are always dealing with contingent constructions, which are deconstructible, not deconstructible just because they're unstable and they fall apart, but because they're yearning for something. They're turned in expectation toward the future. That is a way to think, which I identify with. Apart from any particular views that he might actually hold. That is where I figured that out. That's what it was all about when I wrote Radical Hermeneutics in 1987. And that was the point at which, I like to say, Derrida gave me what it wasn't his to give, which was my voice. If you look at the stuff I wrote before Radical Hermeneutics, and from Radical Hermeneutics on, it's a different voice.
Okay.
Up to Radical Hermeneutics, scholarly, academic, it's my tenure track voice. I tell my graduate students, don't write like this. No way, get tenure first before you start writing. And when I encountered Derrida deeply, carefully, he loosened my tongue. And I really acquired a kind of distinctive voice and style.
Okay, good.
And which I didn't have before that. You look at the stuff I wrote before that, it's fine. It's good, clear academic prose. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not. It's different from radical hermeneutics, and that was Derrida. That was Derrida, but it was also Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, not the edifying discourses so much as the pseudonymous discourses, the humor that Kierkegaard says the humor is the incognito of the religious.
I love it.
Can't beat that.
Amen.
Can't beat that. And then, so in Derrida, you get this sort of playful inventiveness. And then now, I mean, the fact that I was a tenured full professor is a joke, but it's also not a joke. I mean, it really would have been risky to have written like that before. So what I identify almost fully with the how of deconstruction.
Interesting.
But there are various whats. There are various things that Derrida says that I don't agree with. When he starts opining about this or that, he's just another guy, but when he's talking about this way of thinking, that's what's
okay.
And as he got older, he started giving me more of his opinions, because he was famous. When he started talking, nobody interrupted him. That's why his stuff is so long, because the editors are terrified of cutting it. But when he was younger, he was talking about the style of writing and thinking that I identify with.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Great question.
That was
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
And you're always is the first one to give me a thumbs up on Facebook, whatever I do. He's my first thumb.
That's great.
Thank you.
That's great.
Not your last, but the first.
Thank you. Thank you.
Celia, are you still with us?
Hi, yes, I am.
Celia, you had a question about this being a Protestant approach to theology.
I was just thinking about Luther's "Every man his own priest," and my main question would be that in using deconstruction, you're essentially turning theology into a form of hermeneutics, so that we're always interpreting religion, and it's no longer a body of doctrine then, but it's a hermeneutic practice of interpretation. So then I'm wondering, I suppose radical Protestantism would be, look at, we have these schisms and fissures that we keep breaking into further and further cult groups. Do you not risk in treating theology as a hermeneutical practice, do you not risk turning theology into an aesthetics? And then essentially we're appreciating different interpretations, but we are no longer operating out of a shared set of practices and faith systems. Are we even a church any longer? And is this not now simply another aesthetics?
Jeff, you said you were going to pick easy questions for me. Okay. Well, what you're hearing as Protestant, of course, coming from Derrida, was Jewish. So it was Talmudic. It was interpretation. It was, what does God say? Who cares what he says? We're going to argue with him if we don't agree. That's the spirit in Derrida himself. It's not Protestant. But it is, your point is right, which is that it is, interpretation goes all the way down. That in Luther and in Derrida and the Talmud and the Jewish rabbinic tradition and in the Protestant tradition. And that's liberation for me. I think that's emancipation. Now, but it is also true, and this is what I was saying just a few minutes ago about, you got to be careful with this now, because we're in this post-truth, post-facts world, and we're crazy conspiracy theories, and we really are thrown into irresolvable controversy and divisiveness by not really actually adhering to what hermeneutics stands for, which is that interpretations aren't, you don't just pull them out of the air or out of the ear. They're the result of meticulous reading. Now, for me, the notion of a community is of an inside outside, optimal disequilibrium. Optimal disequilibrium. If there isn't something in common, there's no community at all. But if the community is too strong, then it becomes, by the way, this is interesting. The Latin derivation of the word community is not the edifying one, com plus unio, being together with. That's not that derivation of it. In classical Latin, the munio comes from munis, muneris, as in munitions.
Oh.
And a calm munio is a fort, which is fortified on every side against the coming of the other.
Wow.
That's a community in the original literal sense of the word.
Wow.
It's munitions in that word, not unio. Now, so that's the threat of the community, right? The threat of consensus. Quakers love consensus. Well, what does consensus do? It makes you afraid to speak up when you're in the minority. Communities are structurally empowered by definition to excommunicate. That's what makes them a community. Wow. Right? So what you want is what he doesn't call it, but I call it this on his behalf, what Derrida would call a community without community, an open community, which has to maintain a certain kind of disequilibrium, otherwise it excludes the other. So it becomes a fort. But it can't just be nothing, and everything. It's got to have an identity. It has a tradition. It has an identity, but it is not identical with itself. Like you or me. I always like to say, having been a lifelong academic and attended too many committee meetings, the self, the ego, is like the chairperson of a committee who has to make a report of the committee's progress when the committee is locked in irresolvable debates. Right? The ego, the one who says I, is that. It's this person making a report where underneath it is wild multiplicity. So the self is all these things. Who am I? I have all these things. I have all these different relationships and different views. There's an atheist in me. There's a theist in me. There's a conservative in me. There's a liberal. There's a man. There's a woman. There's all the genders to come. I'm all of these different things. Right? So I have an identity. I can get onto an airplane. I have a driver's license that will get me onto an airplane. But I am not identical with myself. And I think that's what communities have. Communities have to have a very strong sense of the contingency of their inherited traditions. You need inherited traditions. If you don't have inherited, you can't have a radical Jesus if you didn't have a tradition that communicated the memory of Jesus. When I talk about radical theology, I mean being born into a tradition, which we all are, whether like it or not, and probing it, digging into it. And then you discover the contingency of all of its structures. They're not worthless, they're just contingent. And they're reformable, revisable, remediable. So you want these formations, but you don't want them to become too strong. You don't want them to be nothing, but you don't want them too strong. I grew up in one like that. See, I didn't worry about the Bible and getting the Bible literally right. I worried about the teachings of the church.
Right.
I worried about, is this what I'm supposed to believe? And I don't want to say anything I'm not supposed to believe.
Yeah.
That's the way I grew up.
Yeah.
When I was little, when I was in grade school, the nuns, most of the nuns. And when I got to high school, they started to wake me up a little bit and tell me that, you know, these things, there's a multifariousness to all of this. So what you want are polymorphic, heterodoxical, shifting, mutating communities.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a balance, right? It's the optimal disequilibrium. You're almost falling over, but you don't.
But you don't.
I love it.
Or if you do, you get up right away.
Thank you. Jim Mock, I think this might be a good follow-up question. Jim, are you there?
Yes, I am.
You had a question about would this understanding of faith and religion be preached in the church?
Yes. Yeah.
Which kind of follows up on what I think we were hearing about.
Yes.
Equilibrium.
I've always felt that certain discussions are worth a beer and others are worth wine and cheese, I guess. I as a young boy, I grew up in a very fundamentalist church atmosphere. And it wasn't until I studied religion at Indiana University that it just opened up the doors to lots of questions, which was good. Because I did, you know, I always had the answers given to me, but not, didn't open up the questions. And I was always wondering, how do we take this body of understanding and knowledge and put it into a form that can be handled on a Sunday at a lectern by a preacher? Because that's where it's at. You know, we can have the wine and cheese, but there comes a time when we have to hit the pavement with things. And in this case, it's typically within a church and within what's being talked about at the lectern, or, you know, the pulpit, I should say.
Well, as a philosophy professor and not a pastor, I would say that's your problem.
Oh, you're back down to wine now, I'm telling you.
Or Dr. Pepper.
Yeah,
Well,
Dr.
I mean,
Pepper.
there are churches in which you would be heard well and welcome, and in a welcoming way if you talk like that. And I would say mostly stay out of rural parishes to the cities and the suburbs.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that our minds in this country right now are just closing. You know, we are polarizing, and people are not listening to one another. It's becoming, we demonize one another. It's becoming impossible to communicate. I've said several times, I'm glad I got my 80 years in when I did. You know, the future is very worrisome. I mean, I think that we're watching this democracy circle the drain. And communicating something like this, you get on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which is 5 minutes from my house, and drive for 30 minutes. I live in Philadelphia suburbs. Drive for 25 minutes, and there are big billboards on the side of the road denouncing the theory of evolution.
Yes.
Pennsylvania is you know, it's Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in between, and that the country's like that. The country is divided. How you would go into a rural parish church and say this and be heard I have, God bless you if you can do that. I don't know how you can do that. We listen to one another. We don't listen to the other side. We don't trust the other side. And we are horribly divided. I mean, if someone were, this was the notion that the Enlightenment, you talk about postmodern. Modernity was the Enlightenment, the birth of science, and God bless modernity and birth of science. But it had this idea that we're all rational agents, and you really just need to provide for a forum for a discussion, and rational beings who will be prompted by rational considerations will reach a rational conclusion. It is nothing of the sort. It has nothing to do with the real world. It happens maybe in a philosophy seminar or in a university seminar, and even then, that's not so true anymore either, because there really is a cult of there's an orthodoxy in the universities that's not just a right-wing conspiracy theory. That's true. I think it's true. So what you're asking is a practical question that I think you would need charisma, and you would need to enjoy. I mean, maybe if you grew up in that place and the people around you trusted you because they knew you, you might be able to get a hearing. I wouldn't be able to get a hearing. You might be able to. Somebody or someone who belongs to that community, who's lived there all their lives, right? But I don't know how you would make it. You go in some places, make a decision of faith and belief, like we're making here. They'll toast you. You'll be on the unemployment line if you're the pastor.
Yeah, I was told that by some pastors that said, I know these things, but if I talk about them, I'll be fired. That's why I ended up joining United Church of Christ. I'm finding them very open and affirming, and willing to discuss topics like this. So, and I loved your presentation today. I've learned so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
Pleasure.
I'm aware of the time, Marianne, and I think it might be time for you to wrap up for us.
Great. Yeah, there's so much to be continue to be explored. And let me just say that one of the things about Jacques' work and Derrida's work that actually gives me some hope is this sense that even though it sounds impossible, the desire for the impossible, the desire for something else, and that is yet to come. And we may not know exactly what it's going to be, but that there's something yet to come, and that's sort of I don't know, maybe even mechanical physics can help us out with that, to say that there is something unexpected that can happen. And Jack, in the future, we'll talk more about event and so forth. But I find at the heart of what Jack is talking about is something hopeful, because for me, it has an intrinsic kind of creativity in it that also, with any luck, has a promise in it as well. Is that just being rose-colored glasses, Jack, or is there something affirming about all of this?
Well, sure. Yeah. That's, you and I are on the same wavelength. I mean, I'm probably virtually everybody this is what we're just talking about. Probably everybody who signed up for this thing has
Right.
the same spirit.
Yeah, because in a sense,
questing.
Right. And in that, I think we've all heard a, if you will, call. And I think that where we are is we're wondering about our own response and our own call to responsibility for what we feel stirring in us. And I feel to borrow from you, Jack, I would just say yes to that. And then we'll see what unfolds. But we're at close time. I'm going to read you a very brief reflection. They're Jack's words from his book, The Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida, Religion Without Religion. We didn't talk about that today, but before that, let me just tell you that the closing music that we're going to use today came out of a chat from last time when I talked about not knowing what's coming, but hopefully, something's coming. Well, somebody said, this sounds like West Side Story. Something's coming. I don't know what it is, but it is going to be great, and we can hope it's going to be great if it doesn't get co-opted. All right. But I loved that. So I decided that would be our closing music for today. Something's coming. I don't know what it is, but it is. Let's just hope it's going to be great. Okay. So that's our closing music. In about 5 minutes, Jack and I will meet those of you who can for some coffee time, some informal chat. But let me close with these words from Jack, and they echo some words also from Derrida. And I actually think that we can all relate to the I in this passage. To what do I pray? Over what do I weep? When in my language, I pray and weep to my God. For what am I hoping, sighing, dreaming? When I hope and sigh and dream of my God. For what am I inviting, calling, promising when I invoke my God? For what do I call when I call in my language, vient, that's the French from Derrida, which is what is to come? What do I call when I call what is to come? By what am I impassioned in my passion for God? To what am I promised? To what do I consent in this pact with the impossible? What do I expect when I expect the impossible? Thank you, Jack, for your prayers and tears, and for keeping hope alive. Thank you all for being with us today. Join us for coffee time if you can. I'll see you next month. And Jack, we will see you again in January. Okay.
Thank you very much.